to our 7th and final episode of this journey via the scientist's garden. Now, just over 1 year ago, we did the first visit to the garden laboratory. That was in the middle of spring. And I wanted to bring you back in early spring when all these fruit trees were in blossom, because that would have been the 12-month journey. Well, that didn't happen. Like everyone else, our year was disrupted by COVID. We brought our gear from the lab to the home office and back again. So now it's early November, late spring, and it's a perfect time for a tour of the garden. So spring is the time when the vegetable garden starts again from sowing seeds, but not so amongst the fruit, the perennials. They just burst into life as soon as the weather warms up. And here on my left is a wall of raspberries, and on my right, a wall of boysenberries. And these will provide us the first delicious pickings of spring. So the joy of spring is the flower garden, and every year it astonishes us with this riot of colour. Now, we're going to go back and visit some of the sites that we spent a lot of time on in earlier episodes. But before we get there, let's just stop and smell the roses. So you'll recognize this spot in the garden. This is where we grew our tomatoes, our furrow irrigated tomatoes last summer. And I've followed them up with onions and garlic. And I'm still not happy with my onion growing. The garlic's a bit small, the onions are bull-necked, too much water, too much fertilizer, too much disease. Next year, I'm going to do a lot better. This is where it was raining pears and nashies last autumn. I was picking them up off the ground. Now, there's slim pickings in an early spring garden, but the season of plenty is still ahead of us. In front of me is the small bed where we grew tomatoes last summer. And you'll remember that I watered with a watering can. Now, that might seem a bit odd, except that the vast majority of smallholder farmers carry water to their gardens each day. And we did the calculation that in summer, you need to carry 30 kilos of water here every single day. Now, when people get sick of carrying water, the next step is a treadle pump, which I've got here. This is mine. I've actually worn this one out, but this is a foot-operated pump, which is really good for pumping from a shallow water source, like a shallow well. So I've actually got a dip well here behind me with a stick in it so I can measure the water level. And after a long, wet winter, we can see that there's free water about 1 metre below this garden at the moment. Now, treadle pumping all day is really hard work. And if you possibly can, they try to buy a petrol or a diesel pump. Now, when you can pump lots of water, well, that's where the difficulty starts. That's where you've got to really know how to use that water properly. People often ask me, what is the aim of the VIA? Are you just trying to sell sensors? Well, not really. The purpose of the VIA is the governance of water, the equitable and just sharing of water, particularly when many farmers share the same water source or share the same irrigation infrastructure. And in those situations, you need data to make sure water is managed properly. Now, of course, we do need a sensor as well. We need a good one. And so What I'm going to do is take you into my lab and just show you some of the quality control that we go through in the making of a chameleon sensor. Once the sensors have been made, they need to be tested. Now, this is probably the most important part of the whole process, what we call quality assurance, making absolutely sure every sensor turns color at the right suction. In our Pretoria production line, every sensor coming off the production line goes through the test beds. We are forever tweaking the design. We're looking for small advances that might make the sensors last longer, be cheaper to manufacture, more accurate. So this is our quality control, but also our way of performance testing different designs or different environmental conditions on the sensors. So we looked at testing sensors in the lab, our quality control procedures. Now this is absolutely core for the VIA, that a sensor that leaves the lab, those colors will change in the correct tension bands, the blue to green to red. So we know that when it leaves. But then sensors go into the big wide world where other things happen. And so in some places we keep testing those sensors to check their accuracy over the longer term. And that's what I'm doing right here. 3 sensors on 3 wires connected to a Wi-Fi reader, but in this case I have 3 tensiometers, also at 3 depths, and right next to the tip of the tensiometer is the chameleon sensor. So one of the things I do is continually dig up sensors and have a look at them. All sensors have a life, and we need to know what that is. And these ones here have been underground for 2 years, and they're showing quite a bit of wear. This different variety here are in better condition. But I'm going to take you to a spot in the garden where we've dug up some really old sensors and we'll have a look at them. I've got a very old sensor where the gypsum has started to dissolve, and in this case the inner sensing material might start to come out. So this sensor is now at its end of life. You will recall that last summer we grew sweet corn here in front of me and here to my left, and we spent quite a lot of time looking at the best way to irrigate sweet corn. Now, in this final episode around the life of a sensor, I want to have a bit of a flashback to look at how we interpreted the chameleon, and in particular how it relates to a tensiometer. When you're less than 20 kilopascals, a chameleon is going to read blue. That means there's quite a lot of water there. As I've said before, soils hold a lot of water in the blue zone, so you stay in the blue for quite a while. Then you hit the green, and the green is up to about 50 kilopascals. You have to give or take a few. And in fact, it's the green zone where you actually should be irrigating. Now, of course, after green, you go red. All of this, of course, is red all the way to 100, and beyond is red. And red is pretty dry. For most soils, it means half the water's gone. It doesn't mean there's no water. There's water there. It's just that if you're red, at least at all depths, you're going to be losing yield in this red zone. Now, here's the first lesson of irrigation. A young crop like this is not sensitive to a small amount of water stress. But when a corn crop is flowering, it's super sensitive to water stress. Make sure it's in the blue then. A major problem is actually over-irrigating a crop when it's young and under-irrigating the same crop when it gets bigger and when it's at a stage that's very sensitive to stress and where you will really be losing yield. So if we'd filmed this final episode at the time we expected, I would have taken you through our glasshouse experiments, particularly this one with the silver beets growing in the bin irrigated with salty water. But let's just have a quick recap of what we did. These 6 pots are all filled with different soils, and by that I mean a different clay or sand percentage in the soil. Now, the more clay in a soil, the smallest particle. Small particles make small pores, and it's much harder to suck water out of small pores. So every different soil type has its own water content at which it must be irrigated, and that's what we're measuring here with these probes, the water content. That's different from a chameleon that measures suction, and of course chameleons don't have to be calibrated for soil type. Blue means blue regardless of the type of soil it is. Now, we also looked at soil as though it was a reservoir that holds water, a bit like the fuel in a car, fuel tank in a car. And if the fuel tank was shaped like a cylinder, then the level would go down gradually for every litre you used. But that's not how soil works. The tank is shaped more like this, where at first the level goes down very slowly, but as the tank narrows, the same amount of water taken out will drop the level very quickly. And this is really the suction, essentially the suction measurer. And this is why it's so difficult to know the right time to irrigate, and why you need to know where the tank narrows, that early warning. And that's of course what the green is on the chameleon, where the tank starts to narrow. So there's one more thing before we go. At numerous times during this video series, I said I'll pull all the loose ends together. Now, if you're watching this video as part of the Water School proper, then you will see the loose ends getting pulled together through the additional presentations. But if you're just watching the videos, I've got one more lesson for you, and it goes like this. Irrigation fails not because it runs out of water, but because there's too much. There's salt in that water, and that salt ends up in our soil. There's also nutrients in the water, which we've put on as well. And we hope those nutrients go up into the silver beet. But this salt we have to push down, otherwise it'll keep building up and up and up. And we want to push it all the way down out the bottom. And of course, I've been catching the water that comes out the bottom of this tank. But what happens if the water can't get out? What happens if the tap is closed? If the conductivity of the lower layers are so low and all the over-irrigation, all that water is just too much? Well, then what happens is the water builds up and up and up and up until we are waterlogged. So some people say that 2,000 hectares per day of irrigated land falls into this high water table, high salinity scenario, which is just so much less productive. And this is my plea. If you haven't enrolled in the Water School, if you're just watching the videos, well, enroll, because we have to learn how to do irrigation differently, and we can do that together. So this brings to an end our year-long journey via the scientist's garden. We'll see you for the next series.